All right, today I am going to attempt to illustrate Carl Jung's process of individuation as I conceptualize it. This may or may not align with your view of what Carl Jung was specifically trying to lay out. And I've definitely conflated this with certain aspects of Eastern mysticism, meditation, specifically from people like Ramana Maharshi, who Carl Jung actually acknowledged as being a conduit for some of the highest philosophical teachings of India. He did not see a huge discrepancy between his theory of the psyche and the theory that was laid out in the East, at least in some models of Eastern philosophy. Okay, well, I'm gonna do a new circle. That's not a good circle. That's not a good circle either, but we're gonna go with it. All right. The self is what we could think of as a container. It's an open space. It's unhindered consciousness. Okay? It's wide, it's open, it contains all the aspects of individual experience and collective experience within itself. Whether this is an objective experience of an external world or a subjective experience of an internal world, it all happens within the confines of the self. Now, self tends to localize itself, tends to condense. And when it condenses, it's almost like it turns into a beam of light, if you can accept that as an analogy. I mean, many religions have used the sun as an example of the highest state of a human being. In Hinduism, they would call this Atman, which is no different from Brahman, who is God. They're identical. And so, back to Carl Jung's system, the self condenses into a focal point that we can call awareness. And like we said, awareness can kind of be conceptualized as a sun that illuminates specific areas of the self. Now, leaving awareness aside for a second, there's a process of becoming. It's a natural process by which an individual who's born into the world they grow up, they have a body, they have a mind, and this body and mind awareness identifies with a body and mind complex. This is the totality of what Western society would call probably the self. They would stop it here, within the mind and within the body, and that's it. That's the human being right there. Everything outside is just an environmental stimulus that can infect the inner parts of our psyche, but are not necessarily a part of it. So this ego is our sense of, all ego means in Latin, right, is I. It's an individual's sense of being an individual. It's that feeling that I am a person in a world. It's pretty fundamental. It's pretty simple, but there are more factors at play than just the feeling that I am an individual. We have biological factors, which could be thought of as the id. These are the inner drives, maybe left over from genetic ancestors, maybe just randomly accumulated desires throughout life. But they are subtle. They're under the conscious radar. We don't physically perceive them as things that we can flip through like a catalog in our minds or anything like that. These are deep in the ocean of consciousness, to the point where it's very hard to become consciously aware of them. And then on the other end of that spectrum, there's the superego. And so if this is like biology, or nature, superego is society or nurture. The superego are all the factors that we have become either consciously or unconsciously aware of that are, not factors, they are moral obligations. They're ethical dilemmas that are instilled in us from our parents, their parents, their parents' parents, our peers, just the agreed upon social norms of a society can be thought of as the superego. The internal natural drives can be thought of as the id. The tension between these two is what creates the specifics of the ego. The psychology, you could say, that comes out of the ego. The ego is what we mistakenly interpret as the self. This is huge, fundamental in Eastern mysticism. We have essentially become blind to the fact that the self is an open awareness. It's a completely open system of experience. And this can be a fairly scary realization, to not have a center point, or say like an anchor to hold us, to tether us to the earth or to some experience of solidity. So essentially, self condenses into awareness. Awareness becomes almost hypnotized, or so focalized on the factors that create the ego, that it becomes the ego. Awareness ends up completely filling the ego, and the ego becomes a new container. But this is limiting. So as awareness has gone from shining as the entire self, it is now condensed and shining at a specific subject, and this subject is an ego. Now remember how we thought of awareness like the sun? Well, this illumination of awareness towards the ego has caused a thick beam of light, as just as an analogy. And this thick beam of light focused on this one object now causes a shadow, right? Because the light of awareness is being blocked by an object, okay? So the blocking of this light cast a shadow. Now this shadow is an accumulation of all the things that the ego is not aware of, but drives it. And the ego has other manifestations. The ego has offshoots of the persona, which is just a mask, right? It's the ego's way that it chooses to interact with the external world. It's how the ego wants others, the external world, to interpret it. This is the true ego. But this is what the ego wants other people to think of it as, okay? And so, as we use awareness to focus consciousness on the specifics of the ego and the persona, which after enough development, this is a natural process that happens in life. Children are born and then they produce egos. The ego just forms. That's just, it's a part of the experience of living, okay? Now, the problem is we forget to move beyond that. We become so obsessed with the fact that we are an individual in an objective world that we lose the bigger picture. We've focalized our awareness on one area, which is the thoughts, essentially, that make up the conception of the ego. This focalization casts a shadow, and this shadow is essentially our blind spot. It's everything that we are not consciously aware of, but drives us. Well, technically that stuff would just end up in the collective unconscious. Okay, yeah, you can't read that anyway. But then it further accumulates into the shadow through our rejecting of it. Okay. See, there are things outside of our awareness that appear in the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious and whatnot. But these things don't negatively affect us to the extent of the shadow. Because the shadow is a collection of things that we have deemed as evil, as completely separate from who we are. So we've excluded them. And so they condense in a little pocket in our blind spot behind awareness. But these things don't stop affecting us. And that's the problem. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not manipulating our behavior. It's not nudging us in one direction or the other. And so the point of this entire illustration is to help people realize that the purpose of individuation is to take that focal point of awareness and expand it or move it. This is what meditation does, okay? As we get the mind to stop analyzing all of experience, once we get the mind to stop thinking about things, okay, awareness itself rests. It retracts back into itself in a way. It balances. It's no longer pulled left, right, up, down. It stays where it is, which is the self. And if we can balance, if we can centralize this awareness, okay, so remember the self is like an open circle. The ego is like this thing that appeared inside the self that we are now focused on. And since we focused on it, we've casted a shadow. We've excluded certain parts. We've created blind spots. So what the goal is of individuation is to get this awareness to move around the board, first of all, to become aware of the different slices of the psychological pie. And eventually, we can stop moving the awareness anywhere. We can unfocus the awareness. We can allow it to be. And this will essentially balance it. We want awareness to be here, shining down from above on everything. We want it to be high noon for that sun at all times. And so we can see the entire landscape of our psyche from a bird's eye view. What we don't want is to have our awareness stolen by individual objects, experiences, and whatnot, and thus identify as those things. Because once that happens, the rest of our psyche gets darkened. It becomes the unconscious aspects of ourselves. And if we aren't conscious of these processes, they rule us from the unconscious parts of our psyche. And I think that's it for right now. More to come, though.